I mean, the trio, usually two of us take like background parts and then he'll do the bass line most of the time and then he says our beatboxer.
There are some stories that the world hears through music, and then there are the stories that music is powerless to tell. The story of Pentatonix belongs to both categories. On the surface, they represent one of the most remarkable musical achievements of the modern era. 5 voices, no instruments, and a sound so precise and emotionally overwhelming that it moved millions of people across every corner of the globe. They won Grammys. They sold out arenas. They racked up billions of views on YouTube at a time when the music industry was still figuring out what YouTube even meant. By every measurable standard, Pentatonix was a triumph. But triumph has a shadow. And in the case of Pentatonix, that shadow was long, quiet, and deeply human. Behind every flawless harmony was a person carrying weight the audience never saw. Behind every polished performance was a private battle that no microphone ever captured. The tragedy of Pentatonix is not the kind that makes tabloid headlines. It is the quieter, more painful kind. The kind that builds slowly inside people who love what they do but are being quietly consumed by the life surrounding it. It is the tragedy of artists who gave everything to their craft and discovered, sometimes too late, that everything includes pieces of yourself you cannot get back. To understand what Pentatonix lost along the way, you first have to understand what they built, and how extraordinary that building process truly was. It began not in a recording studio or a talent agency, but in the hallways of Martin High School in Arlington, Texas. 3 teenagers, Scott Hoying, Kirsten Maldonado, and Mitch Grassi, found each other the way kindred spirits often do, through the recognition of shared difference. Each of them felt like an outsider in the conventional social world of high school. Each of them was too artistic, too expressive, too emotionally alive for environments that rewarded conformity. But when they sang together, something happened that none of them could fully explain. Their voices didn't just blend, they communicated. They created a sound that felt larger than 3 people had any right to make. Their early musical experiments were modest. A local radio contest here, a casual recording there. They lost more than they won. But losing, as it turned out, was refining them. Every attempt sharpened their instincts, deepened their chemistry, and reinforced a truth they were slowly discovering. Together, they were capable of something genuinely rare. When NBC's singing competition The Sing-Off announced auditions for its 3rd season, Scott felt what he later described as an instinctive pull toward the opportunity. But the show required groups of 5, and they were only 3. Fate, or something very much like it, provided the missing pieces. Avi Kaplan arrived first, a bass vocalist with a voice so deep and resonant it seemed to vibrate the floor beneath him. Then came Kevin Olusala, a Yale graduate who had gone viral for an almost incomprehensible skill, playing the cello while simultaneously beatboxing. He didn't just add range to the ensemble. He expanded what the ensemble could even imagine being. The 5 of them rehearsed together for exactly 1 day before their audition. 1 day. And yet when they stepped onto that stage, they sounded like people who had been singing together for a lifetime. They won the Sing-Off Season 3 in 2011, and in doing so, announced themselves to a world that had no real category for what they were. What happened next should have been simple. They had won a major television competition. Recognition and opportunity should have followed naturally. Instead, they were signed to Epic Records and dropped almost immediately. The music industry, it turned out, had no idea what to do with an a cappella group. No formula existed for them. No proven marketing strategy applied. They were, in the eyes of an industry built on templates, a problem without a solution. Most artists would have collapsed under that rejection. Pentatonix did not collapse. They pivoted to YouTube with the kind of determination that only comes from people who have nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. From a small Los Angeles apartment, they began recording covers, meticulously arranged, technically astonishing, visually simple, and uploading them to a platform that rewarded authenticity over budget. The internet recognized something real when it saw it. Their cover of Gautier's Somebody That I Used to Know exploded. Evolution of music traveled across millions of screens. Their subscriber count climbed at a pace that shocked even them. They had built an audience without a label, without a publicist, without a budget. They had done it entirely on the strength of their voices and the intelligence of their instincts. By any measure, it was one of the most remarkable independent rises in the history of modern music. But here is where the tragedy begins to take shape, not in failure, but inside success itself. When fame arrives at the speed Pentatonix experienced it, it does not arrive gently. It arrives as pressure. Suddenly, every video needed to outperform the last one. Every arrangement had to be tighter, more innovative, more impressive than anything they had done before. The fans, devoted, passionate, and growing by the millions, needed to be fed constantly. Content could not slow down. Momentum could not be lost. What had begun as 5 friends making music because they loved it had quietly transformed into something else entirely. A machine that required constant fuel. Each member experienced this pressure differently, and each suffered differently as a result. Scott Hoying, positioned naturally as the group's front-facing leader, carried an almost invisible but crushing burden. He felt personally responsible for the group's direction, its public image, its creative energy, and its emotional unity. The weight of that responsibility compounded quietly over the years, and though his smile rarely wavered in public, he later admitted in interviews that the internal strain had left him genuinely depleted. Being the anchor for 4 other people, while simultaneously managing your own fears and insecurities, is an exhausting way to exist inside what the world views as success. Kirsten Maldonado faced a different and specifically painful kind of pressure. As the only woman in the group, she existed in a space that was structurally male-dominated, where her contributions were sometimes filtered through a lens that had little to do with her actual talent. She carried the emotional labor of the group with a consistency that was rarely acknowledged publicly. The expectation that she would be the stabilizing, nurturing presence, regardless of what she herself needed emotionally, shaped her experience in ways that the public never fully saw. Years passed before she was able to speak openly about those invisible expectations, and when she finally did, her words revealed a woman who had spent a long time setting her own voice aside to make room for the group's collective harmony. Mitch Grassi, perhaps the most visually and vocally distinctive member of the group, struggled with a particular vulnerability that comes from being genuinely extraordinary. His voice was like nothing else in popular music, a countertenor range paired with theatrical instincts that could make an audience feel something without a single word being sung. But artistry at that level is also a form of exposure, and exposure, for Mitch, was not always comfortable. The spotlight that celebrated him also defined him in ways he could not control. His later explorations through solo work and fashion were not frivolous experiments. They were a deeply necessary reaching for self-definition on his own terms. Kevin Olusala, the group's cello-playing beatboxer and in many ways its quiet emotional steadiness, wrestled with the relentless pace of touring life and the personal cost it extracted. He was disciplined and grounded by faith, but discipline has its limits when schedules are punishing and personal life becomes a series of interruptions to a professional one. Becoming a father shifted his entire orientation, giving him a clarity about what mattered that touring schedules and album deadlines had consistently obscured. But the deepest tragedy, the one that shook the fanbase to its foundation, belonged to Avi Kaplan. Avi was the soul of Pentatonix in a way that was almost physical. His bass voice was the ground beneath everything the group built, the warmth, the depth, the gravitational center around which the other 4 voices orbited. Without his voice, their sound was technically still extraordinary. But it felt different. It felt like a house with its foundations slightly shifted. Audiences could sense it, even when they could not name it. What the audience could not sense was what was happening inside Avi himself. He had never been built for the life that fame demanded. He was, by nature and by deep personal preference, a man who needed simplicity, nature, stillness, and authentic human connection. He needed the kind of quiet that touring schedules do not allow. Every month on the road was a month spent further from the version of himself he recognized. Every photo shoot, every rehearsal, every performance asked him to produce a version of himself that felt increasingly foreign. He loved his bandmates. That was never in question. Pentatonix was his family. But there are situations where love is not enough to keep a person from disappearing into something that is consuming them. In 2017, Avi made the decision that had been building inside him for years. He left Pentatonix. The farewell video he recorded was one of the most genuinely heartbreaking moments in recent music history, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so painfully honest. He did not perform grief. He simply told the truth about what the life had cost him. His connection to family, his sense of authenticity, the music that felt true to who he actually was. There was no scandal behind his departure. There was only a person who had reached the absolute limit of what he could give without losing himself entirely. The response from fans was grief in its purest form. Not anger. Not betrayal. Grief. Because what Avi's departure revealed was something that millions of people recognized from their own lives. The particular pain of watching someone you love choose survival over everything else, and understanding, even through your own sadness, that they had no other choice. The group continued. They brought in Matt Sallee, a baritone with genuine warmth and talent, who walked into an impossible situation with remarkable grace. He was joining a group whose fans were still actively mourning. He was stepping into a role that was not described as a role, it was described as a legacy. The emotional complexity of that transition rarely received the attention it deserved. Matt was not simply learning arrangements. He was navigating grief, expectation, and the need to become himself within a space that had been so thoroughly defined by someone else. Over time, he did exactly that. Not by erasing Avi's memory, but by building something genuinely his own alongside it. The group found new dimensions in their sound. They continued winning awards and filling venues. But the experience of rebuilding after such a significant loss had changed them in ways that went beyond the musical. They were more aware of each other's limits, more protective of each other's well-being, more honest about the cost of what they were asking of themselves. Today, Pentatonix stands as something more complicated and more admirable than a successful musical group. They stand as people who walked through significant private suffering while the world watched only the polished surface of their lives. They are artists who gave more than audiences ever knew they were giving, who carried more than they were ever asked to carry publicly, and who chose, repeatedly, painfully, to keep singing anyway. Their story is a reminder that behind every artist whose work moves you is a human being who paid a personal price for that beauty. That the harmony you hear in a finished recording does not reflect the dissonance that preceded it. That success, as the world defines it, is often purchased at a cost that the world never calculates honestly. The tragedy of Pentatonix is not that they failed. It is that they succeeded so thoroughly, for so long, while suffering so quietly. It is that the most real things about them, the exhaustion, the grief, the private doubts, the moments of genuine breaking, were the things their audiences never heard. But perhaps that is also their greatest achievement. Not the Grammys. Not the billions of views. But the fact that through all of it, through loss, reinvention, and the long invisible work of surviving fame, their voices kept rising. And in rising, kept reminding the world of something essential. That the most human thing a person can do, even when everything is difficult, is to keep creating something beautiful. That is the legacy of Pentatonix. And it is, despite everything, extraordinary.